The next segment that we have is a wonderful experience that we came together with a gentleman called Davie Donaldson, who in Scotland is part of the traveller community. And David had done a podcast regarding The Child Unclaimed, which is a story quite close to us in Scotland, and especially where I personally live, because it's just down the road from where I stay. It's an amazing story. He went on a real learning curve, and I submitted some questions to Davie, who's currently in Canada, and asked him if he would talk to us about some of these issues. And so he has kindly recorded a lovely piece for us, and we're going to listen to that. Once Davie's finished, we will leave it there and be back at 4 o'clock for Gary Clapton. And then after Gary, we will be doing some box breathing. So that's the kind of rest of the day. But for now, we're going to listen to Davie. If you haven't seen the Cruelty, The Child Unclaimed, we have got the link in the chat. So please, after today, feel free to go and look at it and watch the series, because it is quite extraordinary what he found out. But we will set forth to share the screen and to be able to show you what Davie has to say. Just making sure you can all hear it.
It's a great privilege to have been invited to talk with you all today.
Can everybody hear Davie in the panel?
Yes.
Fabulous. We're off.
Unfortunately, I'm in Canada at the moment, so I can't join you directly. But Fiona has kindly asked me some questions, and I hope that my answers will not only be of use to you, but that they will help you to reflect on a community that is perhaps one that you might not think about that often. My name is Davie Donaldson. I'm a Scottish traveller, a Nawken in my own language. I'm a campaigner, a researcher, and recently I was the host of a podcast for BBC Sounds called The Cruelty, A Child Unclaimed. It's with this lens that I have contributed to today's valuable discussion. Nicola Sturgeon's recent apology in March 2023 for forced adoption practices throughout the 20th century was an apology long waited for by the victims and survivors of these horrendous practices. She was right to recognise the trauma that forced adoption caused, the stigma and the pain experienced by all those mothers who were all made to feel worthless by the state. Whilst this apology was necessary and long awaited, the Gypsy Traveller communities of Scotland have still received no formal apology for the forced removal of our children, the forced sedentarisation of our pupils in experiment sites, and the systemic segregation of our children in tinker-only schools. These actions were taken by authorities in the name of the Scottish people, underpinned by a racial ideology that believed Gypsy Traveller communities were a social problem, and that by removing our children, the so-called tinker problem wouldn't survive into the next generation. It is important that we are both aware and professionally critical of the role that social work authorities, police, education professionals, religious organisations and third sector organisations all played in the treatment of Gypsy Traveller communities. This is especially important as much of the Gypsy Traveller mistrust of social work practitioners has its origins in the forced removal of Gypsy Traveller children. This practice was a direct result of what is commonly termed the 1895 report. And this was a report which set out to solve the so-called tinker problem. The report was drafted out of an inquiry that was conducted across Scotland to find out about and to report back on Scotland's Gypsy Traveller communities. The report made lots of racist and derogatory, often dehumanising statements, including Gypsy Travellers being the cause of rodent infestations in towns and villages, stating that all Gypsy Travellers were drunkards, and implying that our nomadic way of life was detrimental to a child's development. However, the most severe recommendation of the report was eradication is the only cure. This recommendation was to cement the belief that there was no hope for older gypsy travellers, but that if the children could be removed from their way of life, boarded out to non-gypsy traveller families, or forcibly sent out of the country entirely, then they would no longer grow up to be gypsy travellers. This singular comment helped lead towards a policy which meant hundreds of gypsy traveller children being rounded up, forced into institutions, or even sent to Canada and Australia as domestic labour and farm servants. The children were told that their parents had died, were no longer able to care for them, or simply didn't want them. Mostly the children were never heard of again. The forced shipment continued until the outbreak of World War I, and again after, until World War II. And this chapter in Scotland's history left a legacy of intolerance towards nomadic children, with some gypsy traveller victims talking out about their removal only later in life. And these have included the authors Patsy White, who wrote No Easy Road in 2009, and Sandy Reid, who wrote Never to Return in 2008. Both books that are truly harrowing, but books that I would recommend everyone to read to better understand this chapter in Scotland's history, but most importantly, the impact that it had on the people who lived through it. The Scottish Government need to not only apologise for the historical treatment, especially the forced removals of gypsy traveller children and the forcing of gypsy traveller families into reserves, such as the Tinker experiment site at the Bobbin Mill in Pitlochry. They need to go a step further. They need to acknowledge the transgenerational harm that these practices inflicted on countless generations of gypsy traveller families, and the ongoing systemic racism, structural violence, and regular discrimination that gypsy traveller families face as a result of the stereotypes and the beliefs that these practices helped to cement into the Scottish psyche. It's only when we have a government who will not just produce rhetoric, but will follow this up with sincere action to heal and ensure gypsy traveller ways of life are not only tolerated, but that they are celebrated, that gypsy traveller victims of these practices will be able to move forward. So in short, it's not just about an apology, it's about recognition of the countless victims and the heart-wrenching experiences that these families and individuals had to endure. Through Making the Cruelty a Child Unclaimed, we uncovered a really dark chapter in our country's history. Talking with people who had been removed from their families, told their parents had died, or even that their parents had been abusive toward them, only to find out later in life that none of this was true. This was truly heartbreaking. When I first was approached to make the podcast and support the investigation to find the identity of the unknown Bern, the wee boy who washed up in Tayport in 1971, honestly, I doubted that we would ever come close to finding out who the wee Bern actually was. I felt that too much time had passed, but I also felt an overwhelming feeling of dread, that there must have been a serious reason that nobody ever came forward to claim him. I don't have any Berns, but I can only imagine the pain of not being able to claim your own wee boy, to watch as he's buried by strangers and have no name written on his gravestone. We originally wanted to call the podcast something like The Unknown Bern or Searching for the Lost Bern, but as the story began to develop, we quickly realised that the name of the wee boy was just the tip of the iceberg. We realised that to truly tell his story and acknowledge who he was, we first had to cut through over half a century of fear and neglect. Not of the wee boy, but of a whole people. So we decided instead to allow the Unknown Bern to be that vehicle. to finally have his voice heard, to become the voice of so many unknown Bams lost during the 20th century. So our title hopefully reflects this and seeks to empower not only the wee boy's family to finally have their story heard, but for the listener to actively hear these voices that have been silenced for so long. I have no doubt that the podcast can prove uncomfortable at times to listen to. But honestly, sometimes you have to sit in discomfort. Sometimes you have to recognise your own privilege, and you have to make space for the silenced voices to finally have their say and their platform. So the cruelty therefore means many things. It's a well-known Scottish expression for social workers, but it is also an emotive metaphor that asks the listener to go deeper than initial assumptions on the case of the unknown Bam. It makes the argument for us all to recognise the true cruelty done to the wee boy and the scale of cruelties against Gypsy traveller communities in Scotland. Social work and authorities at large still have so much to do to build trust with Gypsy traveller communities. Partly this is because of the lack of recognition of historical wrongs, but it's also down to a lack of cultural competency and acceptance of different ways of living. The fear that Gypsy traveller communities often have of social work is based on real experience and cultural trauma. Services need to start respecting this and create more effective ways of working with families instead of against them. I've been asked, do we know how many children and young people were lost to the forced removal practices throughout the 20th century? And there are some estimates, but data and statistics are quite honestly hard to come by. To complicate matters more, there is still a massive denial that targeted removal of kids even happened. And this is despite the tranche of lived experience testimony and a whole lost generation of now adults realising that they were born Gypsy travellers. So we may never know the exact number of Gypsy traveller children removed. But what we can say for certain is that there were multiple hundreds, that there are records of systemic abuse toward these children, and that many never returned to their people. As one Scottish traveller elder explained to me, we could go missing and nobody knew. Our own people had no power to find us. The authorities didn't want us to be found. In an age of ancestry DNA kits and online forums, we're starting to see a massive amount of people realising they not only have Gypsy traveller ancestry, but that they or their parents were victims of the racialised removal of children from Gypsy traveller communities. The difficulty and harsh reality is that for many of these people, they have had their Gypsy traveller identities irreplaceably ripped from them. What I mean by this is, you can't learn to be a Gypsy traveller later in life. There are no books you can lift to teach yourself our ways. Our community no longer sees these people as Gypsy travellers. Or to reframe it, an Indigenous spokesperson once explained a similar situation for First Nations children returning from residential schools. They could no longer speak their language. They did not know the social cues or rules. They no longer felt they belonged. This Indigenous campaigner went on to say that she had felt twice colonised. And this expression, twice colonised, is one that's very powerful. And it truly speaks to the emotional impact and the trauma of being moved from your people, not only as a child, but later in life being unable to go back to your people. When preparing this contribution, I was asked, in my opinion, what is the most important traveller tradition? I guess, how do we keep it alive? This is a really difficult question. And whilst the other questions have been hard because they're emotional and in a way trigger a lot of feelings in myself around not only what my people have suffered, but what my family have suffered as well. This one's difficult because for me, boiling the lived identity of a traveller down to just one tradition is impossible. Our people were historically a nomadic people. Increasingly, this has become semi-nomadic due to the pressures from the state, our ancestral camps being built on, and our families facing hostility wherever and whenever we stop. Travelling or shifting to us is an important pillar of our identity. Indeed, I believe for many of us, it's how we create our lived identities as gypsy travellers. But for various reasons, not everyone shifts anymore. So it would be disingenuous to suggest that this is our most important tradition. Our languages, they're important too. They link us as a distinct people to the landscape of Scotland. They articulate emotions that we can't explain in English. And they act as our safety blanket for survival in times of persecution. Our languages have long been a target of cultural dispossession. From the beatings traveller children received in schools for speaking their languages, to the blocking off of our camps where young people would organically learn their language. So language is important. It allows us, in the words of one young Nawken campaigner, to feel Nawken. If I were to put my full support behind just one tradition, it would be our value of family. For gypsy travellers, we measure our wealth not in pound signs and property, but in family. And this can be seen at any funeral, wedding, or christening. It's our tradition to be there for each other. But the fragmentation of our community, due to a lack of culturally appropriate accommodation and support for our travelling patterns from local authorities, it's increasingly becoming difficult to stay as a community, to travel as a community, and to be as a community. And this in turn is increasing anxiety, depression, and sadly skyrocketing suicide rates amongst young people in our community. For me, if non-travellers could do just one thing to ensure our country continues to be home to one of Europe's last nomadic communities, it would be to ensure our families are no longer split apart. To do what you can do to support our people when on the road. On the road, accessing basic sanitation and water is often very difficult for Nawken and other gypsy traveller families. Do what you can do as well, not only to increase local support for travelling patterns, but to challenge stereotypes whenever and wherever you hear them. And lastly, to just treat us as people. To see us as your neighbours, your colleagues, your friends, and recognise that we're just trying to live our lives and love our families like everybody else. So I hope, to be honest, that is my main takeaway from today. I hope you all take the time to listen to our podcast, and please do get in touch with me with any thoughts or feelings that you have around the production. But honestly, I just want you to take away that one message. Thank you all for listening. And again, I'm absolutely delighted to have been able to contribute to this really important event. Thank you.
We're going to take a small break until 4 o'clock. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening. Please do try and find the Cruelty series on BBC Sounds and episodes. Thank you very much.